Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. You know, uh, Knowing you're interested in criminal psychology and the legal system, um, I thought this case would be right up your alley.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Today we're diving into the life and crimes of Howard Arthur Allen, an
Yeah.
American serial killer,
Right.
and we're using his Wikipedia entry as our source material.
Sounds good.
And let me tell you, there are some crazy twists and turns
Oh, I bet.
in this story.
Okay, well, let's get into it.
So,
Yeah, what do we have?
what I find really fascinating is how Alan's childhood might have, shaped his path.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
He was one of 8 kids,
Wow, okay.
raised by a single mother,
Oh, wow.
and they lived in poverty.
I see.
Can you imagine that
Yeah.
environment?
Oh, yeah.
Constant struggle, the
Oh,
instability.
tough.
He even resorted to stealing food sometimes.
Yeah, wow.
It's a far cry from the lives many of us live, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is.
But here's where it gets complicated.
Okay.
The sources paint this really kind of conflicting picture of his cognitive abilities.
Huh. Okay.
Like he was placed in special education
Okay.
and he struggled with reading,
Right.
but then he scored 104 on an IQ test,
Really?
which is average.
Wow, so that's a big difference there.
Yeah. And that discrepancy becomes super important later on when we get into the legal battles.
I bet, yeah.
Um, some experts believe that he may have had trouble with language processing
Okay.
and abstract thinking,
Yeah.
things that could have, a big impact on his judgment
Right, for sure.
and his decision making.
Yeah.
But there's no clear consensus on his mental capacity.
Hmm.
His mother and other people described him as just an average student.
So it's like, was he truly intellectually disabled or was he just failed by the system?
Exactly.
That's a good question.
It's a question that kind of hangs over this whole case.
Wow.
Now, before we really dive into the specifics of his crimes,
Yeah.
I think it's important for us to remember that we're talking about real people,
Oh, yeah.
real lives
Yeah.
that were impacted by Alan's actions.
Right.
It's easy to get caught up in the facts and figures,
Yeah, true.
but we can't forget the human cost of what happened.
Absolutely. We need to approach this with gravity and respect for the victims.
Yeah, they deserve to be remembered.
Yeah, for sure.
So, okay, with that in mind,
Yeah.
let's take a look at the timeline of his crimes.
Okay.
His first conviction came back in 1974
Okay.
for manslaughter.
Okay.
He was only 18.
Wow. He was young.
Yeah, he beat an 85-year-old woman during a burglary,
Oh, my gosh.
and he was sentenced to prison,
Okay.
but got paroled after serving only part of his sentence.
I see.
This is kind of a turning point in the story,
Yeah,
right?
I'd say so.
Prison could have been a deterrent or a chance for him to, rehabilitate,
Right.
but instead it seems like it just hardened him
Oh, wow.
and set the stage for more violence.
And it escalated.
Yeah, it did. Just 2 years after he got out in 1987,
Okay.
he committed another horrifying crime,
Okay.
the brutal murder of 87-year-old Laverne Hale in her home in Indianapolis.
Oh, gosh.
This murder, along with the murder of Ernestine Griffin later that same year,
Okay.
showed a clear pattern of him targeting elderly people.
Hmm.
It makes you think about his motives.
Right.
Was he drawn to their vulnerability?
Yeah, it's a chilling thought.
It is.
Like you have this young man
Yeah.
with this troubled past and all this conflicting evidence about his intellectual abilities,
Right.
now committing these increasingly violent crimes.
Yeah, how do you even begin to unravel that?
Right. What's the why there?
Was it rage, a lack of empathy, or something else entirely?
Maybe a combination.
Yeah.
It's a puzzle we're going to have to try to put together as we go deeper.
Right, and that brings us to his arrest.
Okay.
August 4, 1987.
Okay.
This arrest marked the beginning of a legal battle
Oh, wow.
that would last for decades.
Real.
Allen's case became a focal point for debates about capital punishment
Yeah.
and the rights of people with intellectual disabilities.
It's a tough issue
It really is.
with no easy answers.
No.
Wow.
So he was convicted of the murders of Laverne Hale and Ernestine Griffin,
Okay.
and he was sentenced to death.
Oh, wow.
And he spent a grueling 25 years on death row
Gosh.
while his legal team fought to overturn the sentence.
Right.
They argued that his potential intellectual disability made him ineligible for execution.
Okay, so this is where the legal stuff gets complicated.
Yeah.
Like, you have to meet a very high bar to prove intellectual disability
Right.
in capital punishment cases.
Exactly.
It's not enough to just show that someone has trouble learning.
Right.
You have to prove that their disability prevents them from really understanding what they did.
And the consequences of their actions.
Exactly.
So how did the courts handle this in Allen's case?
Yeah. Were they able to prove it?
And did he stay on death row?
Well, that's what we're going to talk about next time.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, I think everyone's going to want to hear that.
Okay, so last time we were talking about how Howard Allen was on death row.
Right.
And his lawyers were trying to prove that he was intellectually disabled
Exactly.
to get him off of death row.
Yeah.
So what were some of the things they brought up, you know?
Well, they really dug into his past, his early life and his school records.
Mm-hmm.
They pointed out that he was in special ed,
Okay.
that he had always had a really hard time reading.
Right.
And they even brought in experts to talk about his potential cognitive limitations.
Okay, so like how his brain might work differently.
Exactly. And remember, the key here is to prove that his disability really prevented him from understanding the consequences of his actions.
But we also talked about those like conflicting accounts of his intelligence.
Right.
Like his IQ was average.
Yeah, 104.
And some people who knew him said he was totally normal.
Right.
So how did the defense explain that?
Well, they argued that IQ scores don't tell the whole story.
Okay.
They said that even with an average IQ, he could still have problems with abstract thinking and learning, which could still mean he was intellectually disabled in the eyes of the law.
So it was like a battle of interpretations.
Yeah, exactly.
Like who had the right way of looking at the evidence?
Right, and at first the courts weren't buying it.
Really?
Yeah, it seemed like he was going to stay on death row.
Wow, that must have been hard for him and his lawyers.
Yeah, but they didn't give up.
They kept fighting.
Oh, yeah. They filed appeal after appeal.
Wow.
Kept gathering more evidence and refining their arguments.
And it worked.
It did. Eventually, one of those appeals got the court's attention.
Oh, really? So what was it? What changed their minds?
I think the court finally started to see the whole picture. They realized that it wasn't just about his IQ.
Yeah.
It was about his whole life. His struggles in school, the expert opinions.
Right.
It all added up to a pretty convincing case for intellectual disability.
So they finally agreed that executing him would be wrong.
Yes. They ruled that his death sentence should be thrown out.
Wow.
And they resentenced him to 60 years in prison instead.
For the murder of
Laverne Hale.
Laverne Hale, right?
Yeah.
That's still a long time.
It is.
Did he end up serving all 60 years?
Well, actually, things took another turn.
Okay.
Prison records show that he was supposed to be released in 2035.
Okay.
But he died in prison in 2020.
Wow. So even though he got off death row, he never really got to be free.
It's a pretty somber ending to a story with a lot of twists and turns.
It really is.
This deep dive into Howard Allen's case has taken us through some dark territory,
Yeah, for sure.
The dark side of human behavior, the legal system, the death penalty.
Yeah.
It's a lot to think about.
It is what stands out the most to you from all of this.
I think what's most interesting is how this case shows us how hard it is to balance justice with compassion. Right. On one hand, Allen committed horrible crimes.
Yeah.
And the victims' families deserve justice.
Of course.
But if he didn't really understand what he was doing, then was the death penalty really the right answer?
That's a question a lot of people struggle with.
It is.
It makes you think about all those other cases, too.
Right, like where mental illness or trauma played a part.
Exactly.
Howard Allen's case reminds us that the justice system is always evolving, trying to figure out these really tough questions.
And that brings us to a big question for you, the listener. It's really hard, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Like you think about everything we've learned about Howard Allen.
Right.
And, his troubled childhood and then all those years on death row. And then ultimately the court deciding that, maybe he wasn't fully responsible for his actions.
Right.
And it makes you wonder, what does justice really mean in a situation like that?
Yeah, that's a question that's been around for a long time. Philosophers, legal systems.
Yeah. They've been wrestling with this for centuries.
It feels like Allen's case really brings it all into focus, though.
It does.
Like we talked about how hard it is to prove intellectual disability.
Yeah.
All those appeals, the death sentence being overturned. Where do we draw that line between punishment and compassion?
It's a tough one.
It is.
It's all about finding the right balance.
Right.
Like we want people to be held accountable.
Yeah, of course.
Especially when they've hurt others.
Exactly.
But what if they don't even understand what they did wrong?
Right.
Like, was it really their fault?
Is it fair to punish them the same way?
That's the dilemma.
Yeah. And there's no simple answer, is there?
Not really. Every case is different.
Right.
You have to look at the specific crime, the evidence.
As a person's mental state.
Exactly.
The legal system tries to be fair.
It does.
But it's made up of people.
Right.
And people make mistakes.
And things change over time.
Yeah, the law isn't always perfect.
Nope.
And then you think about the bigger picture.
Okay.
Like if someone can be less responsible because of an intellectual disability.
Right.
What about people who commit crimes because of mental illness?
Oh, yeah.
Or trauma?
Or maybe they were raised in a horrible environment.
Right. Like where does it end?
Those are the questions that keep people up at night.
Yeah. The lawyers, the ethicists, everyone.
It's complicated.
Alan's case shows us that the justice system is constantly changing.
It is always trying to adapt.
Trying to figure out the best way to handle these really tough situations.
Exactly.
You know, I think what makes this deep dive so interesting is that it goes beyond just the facts of the case.
It does.
We're not just looking at what happened, but also why it happened.
I know what that means.
And the moral and ethical questions that come up.
For sure, it's not just a simple whodunit.
Right. This case really makes you think.
It does. And remember, this is just one case.
Yeah.
There are so many others out there that raise these same issues. Exactly.
So where should our listener go from here?
Well, if you're interested in learning more about intellectual disability and the death penalty, there are tons of resources out there.
Okay.
Organizations that advocate for people with disabilities, legal scholars writing about this stuff.
Yeah.
It's all out there.
And I think the most important thing is to think about your own beliefs.
Yeah, that's right.
Like, what do you think about the death penalty?
Yeah.
How do you balance justice with mercy?
Big questions.
Yeah, it's something we all need to think about.
Absolutely, no matter what side you're on.
This deep dive was really a journey, wasn't it?
It was.
We went through a lot.
Yeah, from Howard Allen's past to the legal battles.
To his death.
And all the complicated questions in between.
Exactly. And I hope it left you wanting to learn more.
Me too. Knowledge is power.
Yeah. And this case reminds us that things aren't always black and white.
It's the gray areas that make it interesting.
That make us really think about what's right and wrong. That's where the real learning happens.
So thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this deep dive.
I did it.
And until next time, keep asking those tough questions.
Yeah, stay curious.